"The east chimney is drawing smoke again," said the housekeeper, and no one in the corridor answered her. Rosalind Ashworth heard the words from the morning room, where she was seated at the estate desk, with the quarterly ledger open before her, and a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow. She heard them the way she heard most things at Hartwell, clearly, without being in any position to have them acknowledged. She set down her pen, pushed back her chair, and went to find Mrs. Fenwick herself. The great house was silent at this hour, save for the wind pressing at the older windows, and the sound of a child's boot scuffing against the upper landing. Rosalind paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked up. "William," she said quietly, "your lessons ended 20 minutes ago." The boy appeared at the top of the banister, dark-haired and bright-eyed, wearing an expression of elaborate innocence that fooled neither of them. He was 4 years old and had the particular solemnity of a child who understood that most adult conversations required him to look as though he had not been listening. "I was not running," he said. "I did not say you were running. I was going to." She held the silence for 3 seconds, which was enough. He turned and went back down the corridor toward the nursery, without being asked a second time, trailing one hand along the wainscoting. She watched until he was through the door, then turned to find Mrs. Fenwick at her elbow with an air of resigned patience. "The chimney," Rosalind said. "I know. Write to the sweep in Alnwick today, not next week, and tell Mr. Hobbs that if the flue liner is damaged beyond cleaning, we will need to close that room for the winter, rather than heat it inadequately and crack the plaster further." "Yes, Miss Ashworth. And this," Rosalind added, turning back to the morning room, "is the 3rd chimney this quarter. I would like to know before I lose any more to the report I am preparing." She returned to the desk, dipped her pen, and made a note in the margin of the ledger. The figure beside it was precise. 2 chimneys repaired in the spring at 14 shillings each, one blocked outright in July, another drawing improperly now in October. She had been keeping these records for 6 years, and in those 6 years, the estate had been managed by 3 separate stewards sent from London, none of whom had remained long enough to understand that the East Wing's ventilation problems stemmed not from the chimneys themselves, but from a decision made 30 years earlier to raise the east garden wall by 3 feet, which had altered the prevailing air current through every upstairs room in that section of the house. She had written this up in a memorandum the previous autumn. The memorandum sat in a drawer in London, in an office belonging to a solicitor named Mr. Fenton, whose firm administered the estate on behalf of its absent owner. It had been acknowledged with a polite 2-line reply. Nothing had been done. Rosalind had made a second note in her own ledger, marked the date of the reply, and continued. Outside, the October light moved through the garden in thin horizontal bands, and the elms at the far edge of the park had gone entirely gold. She had grown up watching those trees from this window, first as a child at her father's knee, then as his helper, then as his heir in all but law, when his health had failed, and the management of Hartwell's tenants and accounts had passed quietly, without ceremony, into her hands. Her father, George Ashworth, had been estate manager at Hartwell for 31 years. He had died 22 months ago, in December of 1817, at his desk, with a pen in his hand and the November accounts half completed, which Rosalind had finished herself before anyone in the household was told of his death. It had seemed important not to leave things unfinished. He would have agreed. The estate belonged to the Dukedom of Ferncliff. The current Duke, Charles Hawkmoor, had inherited the title and all its attendant complications 4 years earlier, when his father died, and had spent those 4 years, as far as Rosalind could determine, managing the London properties and the estates in Shropshire, and attending to a succession of business affairs that appeared to have left him little occasion to visit Northumberland. She had never met him. She had, however, corrected the invoices sent in his name on 17 separate occasions, recovered £460 in overcharged supplier accounts, and identified, and quietly remedied, a creditor arrangement that the previous steward had entered into on terms that would have cost the estate an additional £200 annually for the next decade. She had done this without authorization and noted it in her own ledger with the dates and figures in case anyone ever asked. No one had asked. She was not, in any formal sense, the estate manager of Hartwell. She was, officially, a dependent, the unmarried daughter of the former manager, permitted to remain in the estate's secondary house while the main house was prepared for eventual sale or occupation. This was the precise language of the letter she had received from Mr. Fenton's firm, 8 months after her father's death, when it had apparently occurred to someone in London that no formal arrangement existed for her continued residency. She had written back requesting clarification of whether the permission extended to her continued assistance with the accounts, given that no replacement manager had yet been appointed. The reply had taken 6 weeks. It said, "For the present, this arrangement may continue at the Duke's discretion." She had been managing the estate on those terms ever since. This was the thing Rosalind had learned, at 26, about institutions and powerful households. They would allow an enormous amount to happen simply because it required effort to stop it, and because the result was useful. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She had found this truth neither bitter nor comforting, merely operational. She had her system, she had her ledger. She had William's small boot scuffing the landing above her every morning, and Mrs. Fenwick bringing the problems to her doorway with the resigned faith of a woman who had stopped hoping anyone else would solve them. It was enough. It had to be. It was into this particular Tuesday, calm and ordered as all her Tuesdays were, that Mr. Fenton's letter arrived. She recognized his firm's seal immediately. She read the letter twice, the first time quickly, the second time with the careful attention she gave to figures that did not add up. His Grace the Duke of Ferncliff intended to visit Hartwell within the fortnight. He was bringing with him a Mr. Aldous Pemberton, a man described as a prospective purchaser's representative, along with his solicitor and 2 advisors. The purpose of the visit was the formal assessment of the estate with a view to sale. The visit was expected to last 5 to 7 days. Miss Ashworth was to make the principal house ready for occupation and to make herself available to answer any questions pertaining to the estate's management. She set the letter down on the desk beside the ledger. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the desk, held it there for a moment, then withdrew it. The estate was to be sold. Of course it was. She had known this was coming, had felt it approaching like weather on a still morning, long before there was any cloud to see. She had simply continued. She picked up her pen and began the list of what needed to be done before a duke arrived. She had 11 days. She used all of them. The house was in considerably better condition than anyone arriving from London would have reason to expect. The accounts showed why. Rosalind had been applying what savings she could extract from the operational budget into targeted repairs for 2 years, prioritizing the rooms most likely to be inspected first, and the systems, drainage, heating, structural, that, if left unaddressed, would cost exponentially more to correct after sale than before. She had written 3 memoranda on this subject and received 3 polite acknowledgments. The good condition of the house was, in its way, an argument. She had spent 6 years building it without anyone asking her to. She had also spoken to the tenants. The 12 tenant farms that bordered Hartwell's parkland were, to a family, deeply uncertain about what a change of ownership would mean for their leases. She had spent 3 evenings visiting the 3 most anxious families in turn: the Carters on the north boundary, who had been at Hartwell since her father's first year; the Holloways at Mill Cottage, whose lease renewal was already 3 months overdue; and old Mr. Trent, who was 71 and had no family to take over his holding, and no understanding of what would become of him if the new owners wanted younger tenants. She had told each of them the truth, which was that she did not know what the sale would mean for their arrangements, but that she was documenting their current terms and tenure with precision, and that she intended to place those records before the Duke directly. She had told Mr. Trent specifically that she had noted the productivity of his land over the past 8 years, and that the figures made a clear argument in his favor. She did not say, "I do not know if anyone will listen." She simply said, "I am writing it down." She was writing it all down. On the morning of the 12th day, the Duke's carriage came through the gate at 10:30, considerably earlier than Mr. Fenton had specified. Rosalind was in the kitchen garden with a trug of autumn cuttings, and her shawl pulled around her against the cold, going through the herb inventory with Cook, when she heard the carriage wheels on the gravel. She handed the trug to the kitchen maid without haste, straightened her spencer, and went around to the front drive. There were 3 carriages. The first was substantial, dark lacquered with brass fittings, the kind that traveled in exactly the state its owner's title warranted. A footman she did not recognize descended from the back and began arranging the steps. Behind the first carriage came a plainer vehicle that would be the solicitor and the advisors, and behind that, a luggage van. She stood on the stone steps of the main house and waited. The man who descended from the first carriage was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark traveling coat of excellent cut, wearing no particular ornamentation. He moved with the economy of a man who had been making decisions for a long time and had stopped finding them interesting. He looked at the house first, a long, measuring look that took in the roofline, the condition of the stone, the repaired window casings on the east wing, and then, only then, looked at her. He had dark hair, worn close. He was perhaps 32 or 33. His face was not precisely handsome. It was too composed for that, too self-contained. But it was the face of someone accustomed to being attended to and no longer requiring it. He looked at Rosalind the way he had looked at the roofline, assessing, specific, unhurried. "Miss Ashworth," he said. It was not a question. He had evidently been informed. "Your Grace," she said, "welcome to Hartwell." He came up the steps and paused beside her, close enough that she was aware of the cold coming off his coat and the faint smell of road dust. He looked at the east wing again. "The window casings," he said. "When were those repaired?" 7 months ago, she said. "Before the spring wet came in. The lintel above the second casement had rotted through. I engaged a carpenter from Alnwick on a 3-day contract. The total cost is in the ledger." He looked at her then, a brief, direct look, and she had the impression that she had said something he had not expected. He did not say what it was. He went inside. Charles Hawkmoor had not intended to come to Northumberland. He had intended, from the comfortable distance of his London offices, to arrange the sale of Hartwell through his solicitor and his advisers, and the prospective purchaser's representative, to sign what needed signing, and to be done with a property he had inherited, along with a great deal else he had never asked for. He had visited Hartwell once as a child, at 8 years old, brought north by his mother on a journey she had called an adventure, and he had experienced as a revelation. The wide fields, the cold light, the sound the wind made in the elms at the edge of the park. His mother had loved the north. She had died when he was 14, and he had not been back since. He had told himself this was irrelevant. The estate was not producing sufficiently to justify the administrative weight. The London firm was managing it at ongoing expense, and a sale was the rational decision. His man of business had agreed. His advisers had agreed. The only dissenting voice had come, unexpectedly, from the ledgers themselves. He had received, through Fenton's office, a quarterly summary of Hartwell's accounts for the past 2 years. This was routine. What was not routine was the precision of the summaries, the marginal notes, the cross-referenced repair logs, the 3 separate instances of recovered cost, carefully annotated with dates, amounts, and the names of the parties from whom the recovery had been made. The handwriting was small and very clear. It was not Fenton's handwriting, and it was not any of the steward's handwriting he recognized from previous correspondence. He had asked Fenton who was managing the accounts. Fenton's reply had taken a week and was, Charles thought, somewhat embarrassed in its tone. Miss Ashworth, it said, the former manager's daughter, still resident on the property, had been assisting informally with the estate administration. The firm had understood this to be a temporary arrangement. It had continued for some time. Fenton had not wished to suggest the firm had been unaware of this. Charles had read that letter several times. Then he had requested the full ledger records for the previous 3 years. The ledger had arrived by private courier. It was thorough, in a way that the word thorough did not adequately describe. It was exhaustive and precise and structured, with a logic that he, who had spent 12 years managing large financial interests, recognized immediately as the work of someone who had been thinking about Hartwell's problems for a very long time, and had been solving them in the only ways available to her. Every decision was dated, every expenditure was justified, every recovery was documented. He had held the ledger in his hands for 20 minutes before deciding that he was going to Northumberland. He had told Pemberton this was to allow him to conduct the assessment in person. This was true. It was not the only true thing. He spent his first morning at Hartwell with Pemberton and the 2 advisers, going through the house room by room, which was the necessary first order of business, and which Rosalind Ashworth conducted with a quietness that he found himself listening to, rather than watching. She opened doors and stood aside and answered questions in complete sentences, with specific figures, without being asked twice for any of them. She knew every repair, every measurement, every tenant, every outstanding agreement. When Pemberton asked about the south-facing drawing room's ceiling plasterwork, she produced a written estimate she had requested from an Alnwick craftsman the previous month. along with a note on the cause of the damage and a recommendation for preventing its recurrence. When the senior advisor asked about the mill lease on the western boundary, she opened a folder and showed him the current terms, the renewal history going back 12 years, and the market rate for comparable mill leases in the region. Pemberton, who was a methodical man, wrote things in his notebook. The advisors exchanged a look that Charles intercepted without allowing his expression to change. He said nothing during the tour that morning. He watched, and he listened, and he noted that she never looked at him directly for more than a moment, not from shyness, he thought, but from the particular discipline of someone who had learned not to expect much from the attention of people who held power over her circumstances. That afternoon, while Pemberton and the advisors reviewed their notes and his solicitor attended to correspondence, Charles went to find the estate ledger. He found her in the morning room, which appeared to be her office in every practical sense. There was a desk marked with the rings of teacups, a bookshelf organized with the thoroughness of someone who had built it themselves, and 3 ledgers stacked with the current one, open at the October entries. She was seated at the desk when he came to the door, but she rose immediately. "Your Grace, please sit," he said. "I would like to look at these, if you have no objection." She sat. He picked up the nearest ledger, the oldest of the 3, dated from 6 years back, and turned to the first page. The entries from the early months were in a different hand, her father's, he understood. Then there was a gap of 2 weeks in the spring of that year, and when the entries resumed, the handwriting had changed. He looked at her. "When did you begin?" "In April of 1814, she said. "My father had an episode with his lungs that spring. It was not the episode that ultimately—" She paused. "He recovered that time, but he needed to rest for 3 weeks, and there were several outstanding supplier accounts that required immediate attention, so I addressed them, and then continued. He turned pages. He had read the summaries, but reading the ledger itself was a different experience. He could see the thinking behind each entry, the connections drawn between one season's problem and the next, the way she had been building a coherent picture of the estate's mechanics, with a patience that had apparently required no external encouragement whatsoever. He stopped at an entry from the previous November. "This recovery from Whitmore's mill," he said. 3 years of overcharge on the grinding contract. 2 years and 8 months, she said. The original contract was negotiated by the second steward, Mr. Dawes, on terms that were reasonable in 1812, but had not been revised when grain prices shifted in 1815. Whitmore's had been billing at the old rate, plus an undocumented handling fee. I found the original contract in the correspondence files, compared it with the current invoices, and wrote to them with the figures. They paid the recovery. They paid 29 of the 37 pounds I identified. I accepted that figure and revised the contract going forward. She paused. "I have the correspondence, if you wish to see it." He looked at her steadily. She did not look away. She had very calm eyes, dark gray, attentive, and she held his gaze with the self-possession of someone who had nothing to apologize for. "Who authorized you to negotiate with them?" he asked. "No one," she said. "I wrote to Mr. Fenton first to explain the discrepancy and recommend a correction. He did not reply within 4 weeks, and the quarterly invoice was due, so I wrote to Whitmore's directly and noted that I was acting in the estate's interest, pending formal authorization." She folded her hands on the desk. "I have done that several times." "I know," he said. He set the ledger down. She looked at him then, with the particular expression of someone recalibrating what kind of conversation they are in. "I have read all 3 ledgers," he said, "before I came. That is in part why I came." He did not say anything else. He simply picked up the ledger again and turned to the current month's entries, and they sat in the morning room for the better part of an hour while she answered his questions, and he worked through the figures with the focused attention of a man who had, apparently, decided that this conversation was worth his complete presence. He had not expected her to be like this. He was not certain what he had expected. Someone worn down, perhaps, or quietly resentful, or performing gratitude for her continued residency. He had encountered all 3 of those things in dependent situations and recognized them immediately. Rosalind Ashworth was none of those things. She was simply herself, very clearly, with no apparent interest in being anything else. That evening, he stood for a moment at the window of the study his father had used on visits. His mother too, he thought. She had stood at this window. He almost remembered it. and looked out at the elm trees going dark in the evening. He had told Pemberton they would need at least 2 more days. Pemberton had accepted this without surprise. He was a thorough man himself, and felt the assessment warranted the time. Charles had also, in the late afternoon, heard a child's voice from the upstairs corridor. He had not been told there was a child at Hartwell. He went back to the desk in the study and read Fenton's letters again, 6 months' worth, and found no mention of it. He could ask Fenton, but Fenton had shown himself to be a man who omitted things and then expressed embarrassment about the omission afterward. He would ask Miss Ashworth in the morning. Rosalind had known this conversation was coming. She had, in fact, been composing versions of it in her head since the moment she had seen the carriages on the drive. She was not given to imagining worse outcomes than the ones she was actually facing, but she was given to preparing, and she had prepared for this one with the same systematic attention she brought to disputed invoices and overdue tenant renewals. She had thought about William for 6 years, not in the way people would assume, if they knew, not with anxiety or defensiveness, but with the quiet, steadying force of having made a decision and stood behind it, through everything that had come since. He had been left at Hartwell's gate on a December morning in 1815, in a basket lined with a good wool blanket, with no note and no indication of his origins beyond the single fact that he was newborn and someone had chosen this particular gate. Rosalind had been 20 years old. Her father had still been well. The local magistrate had been applied to and had conducted the customary inquiries, which had produced nothing. The workhouse in Alnwick had been the suggested alternative. Rosalind had looked at that suggestion for a long time and then made the decision that she was not going to accept it, which meant she was accepting something else entirely. She had spoken to her father, who had agreed in the simple, direct way he agreed to most of her reasoning. She had registered William with the parish. She had written to Fenton's office, informing them that a foundling child was in residence on the estate, that she was providing for his care, and that she would notify them if the situation changed. Fenton's office had replied that this was understood and that she should keep the firm informed. She had kept the firm informed, quarterly, for 4 years. The replies had been brief and made no instruction to the contrary. She had not mentioned this to the Duke in the morning room yesterday, because he had not asked, and she had been waiting to understand what kind of man he was before she placed William in his awareness, deliberately. She had 1 day of observation. She thought that was probably enough. He found her in the kitchen garden before 9, where she was doing the herb inventory she had not finished on the day he arrived. He came around the corner of the garden wall and stopped when he saw her, and she had the impression that he had been walking with some intention and had now arrived at it. "The child," he said. She set down the trug. "Yes, tell me." She told him clearly and without embellishment. The circumstances, the decision, the letters to Fenton, the quarterly reports. She told him the parish record. She told him William was 4 years old and currently in the nursery with Mrs. Horton, who had been his nurse since he was 18 months. Charles listened without interrupting. When she had finished, she waited. "I would like to meet him," he said. This was not what she had expected him to say. She had expected questions about legal standing, residency terms, the estate's liability. She studied his face for a moment and found it composed and entirely unreadable. "Of course," she said, "after his lessons." What she had not said, and what she watched him understand over the course of the next 3 days, was the thing she had known from the beginning and had kept contained inside the same internal discipline with which she kept everything else. William had dark hair and very dark eyes, and a certain quality of stillness that sat oddly on a small child, the kind of composure that seemed to come from somewhere rather than being acquired. She had not known what it meant when he was an infant. She had begun to understand it as he grew. She had not, until now, had any way to act on the understanding. Charles Hawkmore met William in the nursery at 4 o'clock, in the careful, slightly formal way that he brought to all unfamiliar situations. William regarded him from across the room with the complete seriousness he brought to most things. Then he crossed the room without being invited and stood directly in front of Charles and looked up at him. "You are very tall," William said. "I am," Charles agreed. "My father was tall," William said, with the casual authority of a 4-year-old reporting established fact. "Miss Rosalind said so." Charles looked at her over the boy's head. She met his gaze steadily. She had told William what little she could construct from what she knew, that he had a father somewhere, that he was cared for, She had told him nothing specific, because she had known nothing specific. She was watching Charles's face, and she saw the thing she had seen every time she had looked at William carefully enough. The angle of the jaw, the set of the brow, the quality of the stillness. The boy was looking up at Charles with enormous dark eyes, completely unafraid. Charles lowered himself to one knee so that he was at the child's level. "What is your name?" he asked. "William Ashworth," the boy said. Then, with the thoughtfulness of a child who has considered this, "I may have another name. Miss Rosalind says we are not sure yet." Charles was very still for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "We will find out." He rose and looked at Rosalind, and something in his expression had changed in a way she could not yet fully read. It was not a simple thing. It was not just recognition or guilt or the shock of the unexpected. It was more complex than any of those, heavier and quieter, and she found she needed a moment before she trusted herself to speak. "I did not know," she said. "I want to be clear that I did not know, when I wrote to the firm, that there was any connection. I reported only the facts." "I understand that," he said. "If I had known," she paused, "I am not certain what I would have done differently, except perhaps have written to you directly, rather than to Mr. Fenton." He looked at her with a directness that she was beginning to understand as simply the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. "Who was his mother?" "I do not know," she said. "The inquiries found nothing. There was a good wool blanket in the basket, quality that suggested means, not poverty." The basket itself was plain. There was nothing written. He moved to the window of the nursery and stood there for a moment, looking out at the garden. He had the bearing of a man doing difficult arithmetic in his head, and she did not interrupt it. She had managed difficult things before breakfast for 6 years. She could manage this. When he turned back, he said, "I need you to tell me everything you know, all of it, in detail, tomorrow morning." "Yes," she said. "I need the letters to Fenton, the parish record, all of it." "I have all of it," she said. "I have always kept all of it." He looked at her again, with that long, specific attention. "Yes," he said, more quietly. "I expect you have." The next morning was the 4th of his visit. Pemberton had completed his assessment and was, from the look of him at dinner, developing reservations about the sale that had not been present when he arrived. Charles had not commented on this. He was thinking about other things. He spent 2 hours with Rosalind in the morning room, going through everything she had kept. She produced the letters, the parish record, William's informal registration, the quarterly reports to Fenton, all organized chronologically in a folder she had evidently assembled some time ago, not in preparation for his arrival, but as a matter of standard practice. The documents were annotated in her small, clear handwriting, cross-referenced, thorough. It was exactly the way she kept everything else. He read it all. She sat across from him and answered his questions with the same quiet precision she brought to supplier accounts and chimney repairs, and he found himself thinking that she had been living with the uncertainty of this for 4 years, and had apparently chosen to address it in the only way available to her, which was to document everything carefully and wait for whoever held the authority to do something about it to eventually pay attention. "Do you know why no one investigated further?" he asked. "The magistrate conducted the customary inquiry," she said. "A newborn foundling at the gate of a private estate. The estate is remote. The inquiry did not find anyone who admitted to knowing anything." She paused. "I suspect there were things that could have been known, if someone had known where to ask. I did not have the means to ask in those places." "But you suspected." "I noticed," she said carefully. "I did not permit myself to draw conclusions from a resemblance, because I had no way to act on them, and conclusions without action serve no one. So I kept the records, and I waited." He put down the last letter and looked at the folder. Then he said he was not going to be sent to a workhouse. It was not a question, and it was not directed precisely at her. He said it the way a man says a thing he is working out as he says it, arriving at a fact from the outside. "No," she said. He was not. Charles looked at her then, with something that was not quite the measuring assessment she had seen from him before. It was something quieter and more specific. She held his gaze. "I am going to need to make inquiries," he said. "Not through Fenton, directly. Through people who can ask, in the places the magistrate did not." He paused. "I am also going to need to extend this visit." "I will have Mrs. Fenwick see to the rooms," she said. He almost smiled. It was a very small thing, quickly contained, but she saw it. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer it directly." "I generally do." "What do you want?" he said. "Not William's situation, yours. You have been managing this estate for 6 years, without any formal acknowledgement, any salary beyond what Fenton's office has presumably been paying you." "They have not been paying me anything," she said. He stopped. "My father's arrangement included accommodation for us both," she said. "When he died, the accommodation was extended to me. There was no salary attached to his position that transferred, and I did not have a position. I had a continuing arrangement." She said this without bitterness, the way she would state the terms of a supplier contract. "I have been managing the operating budget and, when there was a surplus in a given quarter, applying some portion of it to repairs I judged essential. I noted all of this in the ledger." He was very still. "For 2 years. For 2 years." He stood up from the desk and went to the window, and she watched him from across the room with the patience of someone who had learned that the truth, once placed in front of someone, sometimes needed a moment before it was accepted. "I owe you," he said, "a considerable amount of money." "Yes," she said. "I have calculated it. It is in the 3rd ledger, in the back section, with an annotated explanation." He turned to look at her. "You calculated it. I thought it was information that might eventually be relevant," she said. This time he did smile, not widely, and not for long, but it was real, and it changed his face entirely. She had the sensation of looking at the house when the morning light hit it correctly, and revealed what it was actually built of, beneath the weather it had endured. She did not let this observation interfere with her composure. She returned to her list. The days that followed had a quality she had not anticipated, and found difficult to categorize. He remained at Hartwell for a total of 12 days, and during that time he established a pattern of working mornings with Pemberton and his advisors, and then coming to find her in the afternoon, in the morning room, in the kitchen garden, once in the estate records room, where she was cross-referencing the tenant files, and continuing the conversation that had been, as near as she could tell, going on between them since that first morning on the front steps. She had not expected him to come to the garden. She had been staking the last of the autumn roses against the expected frost when he appeared at the garden gate and paused there, looking at the work, with the same careful attention he brought to everything. He had removed his coat, she noticed this, the tailcoat folded over the fence rail, and stood in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves in the October cold, which struck her as deeply impractical. "The frost estimate," he said. "How far off is it?" "A week, perhaps 2, she said. "The nights are not yet cold enough, but the roses on the south wall are already too exposed, and if I wait, the stakes will not matter." He came through the gate and without ceremony held the stake while she tied the cane. They worked down the south wall in this manner for 20 minutes, she directing, he assisting, both of them entirely focused on the work, and she thought that there was something in this that she would not have predicted and would not have sought, and which she had no name for yet, this particular quality of company. He said, at some point along the wall, "I had an investigator's report this morning." She stilled with the twine in her hands. "Early," he said, "faster than I expected." He paused. "There was a woman. She died in January of 1816. A widow of modest means in Berwick. She had been in service before her marriage, and before that she had been in—" He stopped. He said the next part quietly. "She had been in service at my father's London house, in 1813 and 1814. Rosalind did not move. She held the twine. "She had a brother in the area," he said. The brother confirmed what the investigator found in the parish records. He was looking at the wall, not at her. "I am his father, or rather, my father was not there to be his father, and so the question of what I am to him is something I have not yet fully resolved." He paused. "But I am responsible for him. That is not in question." She tied off the twine and straightened. She was aware that her hands were steady, which was not a small thing. "What does that mean for him?" she asked. "It means he will be recognized," Charles said. "There are limitations to what can be done formally. There are always limitations. But he will not be at a gate again. He will not be uncertain. He will have his name settled and his future settled." He finally looked at her. "And it means that whatever arrangement has existed until now, the informal one, the one that runs on a continuing courtesy and your apparently inexhaustible willingness to work without being asked, that arrangement ends." She looked at him carefully. "In what sense does it end?" He turned to face her fully. "I am not selling Hartwell," he said. She had not expected this either. She was accustomed to being surprised, less accustomed to being surprised in ways that required her to sit down and think for a long time. She pressed one hand briefly against the garden wall, felt the cold stone under her fingers, and returned her attention to him. "Pemberton's report recommended against sale," he continued. "The estate's condition and the corrected account projections, which I note substantially resemble the projections you included in your third memorandum to Fenton's office, suggest that Hartwell is undervalued at any reasonable sale price and would generate considerably better returns if properly managed." "I know," she said. "That is what the memorandum said." "Yes," he said. "It was a good memorandum." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you proposing precisely?" He was very still. In the way she had come to understand, was not absence, but the opposite, the particular quality of attention he brought to things he had decided about. "I intend to appoint a formal estate manager," he said, "with a salary, a written contract, and the authority that the position requires." She waited. "I am aware," he said, "that you have been performing this role. I am aware that offering it to you now, after 6 years, is neither generous nor sufficient." He paused. "But it is what is available, and I believe you should have it." "I agree," she said. He looked at her with something that was almost startled. "You agree?" "I have been doing the work," she said. "I should have the position. Yes. I agree with you." She met his eyes. "I would like to review the contract terms before I sign anything." He almost laughed. She was beginning to recognize the quality of the thing he substituted for laughter, the very small shift at the corner of his mouth. "Of course you would." She drafted the contract terms herself, which was perhaps not the conventional approach, but she had the advantage of 6 years of operational understanding, and he had the advantage of being the Duke, which meant that when she presented the draft to his solicitor, the solicitor read it with great care and found 2 clauses he wished to adjust, one regarding the scope of authority over tenant negotiations, and one regarding the discretionary repair budget, and she negotiated both of them to her satisfaction in the course of a single afternoon meeting, at which Charles was present, but largely silent. He signed the final document that evening in the study. She signed it across from him at the same desk, with the same pen, and was struck by the particular weight of an ordinary moment that was not ordinary at all. He left for London 5 days later, taking his solicitor and his advisors and a folder of documents pertaining to William's recognition with him. Pemberton, who had been unexpectedly charmed by the estate, took copies of Rosalind's tenant reports with him. At the front door, before he descended to the carriage, Charles paused on the top step beside her. He had been looking at the east wing's roofline. She had come to understand that he did this, that his particular attention to the house was something he had needed to give himself permission for. He looked at her. "The chimney in the east drawing room," he said. "Investigate the garden wall. I believe you were right about the air current." "I know I was right about it," she said. "I will have it assessed." The corner of his mouth. "Good." He paused again. "I will return in the spring." "William will be pleased," she said. "Yes," he said. He looked at her for a moment with the quiet, specific attention she had stopped trying to categorize and had started simply receiving. "Miss Ashworth, Your Grace." He descended the steps and was handed into the carriage and was gone. She stood on the steps for a moment, then went inside and made a note in the ledger. He returned in March, earlier than spring strictly warranted, on a day when the park was still half frozen and the lambs were only just arriving in the tenant farm's fields. He came with only his valet and a groom, no advisors, no solicitor, and Rosalind, who had received no letter and no warning, came out from the morning room to find him standing in the entrance hall, looking at the painting of the North Park that had hung above the console table, since long before either of them had been born. "Your Grace," she said. He turned. He had been traveling, and it showed in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his attention, which was more direct than it had been in October, less carefully managed. He said, "How is William?" "Tall," she said. "He has grown since October, and he has been asking when you were coming back." Something in Charles's face changed when she said this, a brief, unguarded thing. He said, "I should have written." "You should have," she agreed. "The East Garden Wall assessment is finished. You should see the report." He looked at her for a moment. "Miss Ashworth," he said, I did not come for the report. She was quiet. I came back, he said, because I could not reasonably find a way to stay away. He said this with the precision of a man who has thought about something for a long time and arrived at the simplest true version. I have been thinking since October about what I missed, what my father failed to manage, or chose not to manage, or he was not a man who attended to the consequences of his choices. He paused. I have been thinking about William, and I have been thinking about you. She stood very still. Not in a practical sense, he said. Not because the situation requires it, or because it is convenient, or because there is any argument to be made from structure or necessity. I have been thinking about you because you are the most competent, most honest, most entirely herself person I have encountered in a very long time, and because I am aware that I owe you considerably more than back wages and a signed contract, and because— He stopped. He had been standing some distance from her. He crossed the hall in 3 steps and stood close enough that she could see the frost still on the shoulders of his coat and the fact that his cravat was slightly crooked from the journey. She reached up and straightened it. She did this with the matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to most things, adjusting the linen with her fingers, and then left her hand there for a moment, pressed briefly against the lapel of his coat. "It has been crooked," she said, "since you came through the door." "I know," he said. "I was hoping you would notice." She looked up at him. He was watching her, with the full, serious, uncalculating attention that she had spent 26 years waiting to receive from anyone. "I have been thinking about you as well," she said, "for what it is worth. Since October. It is worth a great deal," he said. He did not kiss her. He took her hand, the one that had straightened his cravat, still near his lapel, and held it with the gravity of a man making a commitment, and she held his in return, with the same quiet deliberateness. They stood like that in the entrance hall of Hartwell for a long moment, with the March light coming through the tall windows, and the sound of William's boot making its customary circuit on the upper landing above them. He proposed formally that evening, in the proper manner, in the drawing room after dinner, with the intention that she should have the form of it if she wanted it. She thought about it for 3 full minutes. He knew this because she was evidently counting, and he was not going to hurry her, and then said, "I would like to speak to Mr. Ashworth's portrait first." He blinked. "My father's portrait," she said. "It is in the library." He would have found this very satisfying, and I think I owe him the information. She went to the library and stood before the portrait. He came with her, which she had not exactly expected, but found she did not object to, and she looked at her father's painted face for a moment in the quiet. Then she turned to Charles and said yes. The actual proposal came later, when the house was still. He found her in the morning room at 11 o'clock, which was where she always was at 11 o'clock. And she was reviewing the spring planting accounts when he came to the door. He said, "Not because the estate requires a manager, and not because William requires a mother, and not because it resolves anything structural, because you are the person I wish to speak with at the end of every day, and because you see things clearly in a way that I would very much like to have near me for the rest of my life." She set down her pen. She thought about it, not for 3 minutes this time, but for a single long, honest moment, in which she allowed herself to understand what she was being offered, and what it would mean, and what she wanted. "Yes," she said again. "You agreed very quickly that time," he said. "I had already done the thinking," she said. The first answer was the right answer. He smiled, fully, unhurriedly, in the way she had only seen once before. It was a very good smile. She was glad she had found it. They were married in June, in the parish church in Alnwick, in a ceremony attended by the 12 tenant families, Mrs. Fenwick, a handful of Charles's London acquaintances, who had made the journey north with expressions of faint bewilderment, and William, who served as an unlikely honorary witness at age 4.5, and managed to stand still for almost the entire service. Lady Harwick, who had been considered by at least 3 separate people in Charles's social circle as the probable future Duchess of Ferncliff, she was credentialed, elegant, and entirely certain of her position until the letter arrived from Northumberland, sent a card expressing congratulations. It was polite, brief, and took some effort to compose. Rosalind read it and wrote a gracious reply and moved on to the next item on her list. Lady Harwick had done nothing wrong. She had simply been looking at a situation that was not, and had never been, quite what she thought it was. Lord Ferncliff, Charles's great-uncle and the family's senior patriarch, came to hear of the marriage through the solicitor's announcement and sent a brief, stiff note to the effect that he had expected better judgment and wished to express his reservations in the strongest possible terms. He arrived at Hartwell the following autumn in person, ostensibly to inspect the estate, and Rosalind received him at the door and gave him a full accounting of the property's improvement over 3 years, including the specific figures: £430 in recovered supplier accounts, 12 tenant leases stabilized, the east garden wall corrected, and the chimney problem resolved entirely in its wake. He listened with the sourness of a man who has come prepared to find fault and cannot locate it. He said, at the end of the tour, "The accounts are in better order than they were under any previous arrangement." "Yes," Rosalind said, "I know." He looked at her with the difficult expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he did not want. "My nephew is not without sense," he said finally, which was the closest he had in him to acknowledgement. He left the next morning and sent no further letters of reservation. It was enough. She had not needed his approval. She had simply wanted him to see the work, and he had. The first Christmas at Hartwell as Duchess was not quiet. It never was quiet again, as it turned out. William was 5 and had developed opinions about everything, and there were guests from both the London properties and the Shropshire estate, and Mrs. Fenwick was managing 3 kitchens' worth of correspondence simultaneously, with her customary resigned competence. On a night in early January, when the house had settled and the fires had burned down, Rosalind sat at the morning room desk, her desk, with its familiar ring marks and its 3 ledgers, and wrote the first annual summary of the estate under her formal management. She had been writing these summaries for 6 years, but this was the first one that bore her title and her signature and the date in full. She heard Charles come to the door before she looked up. He had a particular quality of presence in the doorway, very still, no performance, and she had learned it the way she had learned the sound of William's boot on the landing, which is to say that she could have identified it in the dark without any additional information. "You should be asleep," she said without turning. "So should you," he said. "I am nearly finished." She heard him come into the room. She heard him stop behind her chair and look over her shoulder at the ledger. She felt his hand rest briefly on her shoulder, one warm, deliberate weight, and then his presence settling into the chair across the desk as he picked up the letter she had left for him to read, which was the proposal she had drafted to the neighboring estate managers regarding the adoption of her account system, based on 3 years of evidence that it reduced operating losses by a measurable figure. He read it in silence. She continued writing. After a while he said, "Adderley will adopt it. Adderley has already expressed interest," she said. "I spoke to his steward at the Christmas assembly." A pause, naturally. She finished the entry she was writing, closed the ledger, and looked up at him across the desk. He was watching her with a particular expression she had stopped trying to name, and simply accepted as the thing she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it. "Come to bed," he said. "The accounts will be here in the morning." "They will," she said. "They always are." She rose. She moved toward the door, and he came with her, and at the door he reached past her and held it, which he had done every evening since March of that year, with the quiet consistency of someone who had decided on a habit and had no intention of abandoning it. She stopped briefly in the corridor and listened. The house was utterly still. William, 3 rooms away, was soundly asleep. She had checked on him at 9, and he had been curled under his counterpane with his dark hair against the white linen, one hand loosely open, as small and complete, and certain of his place in the world as she had always intended him to be. Their son James arrived in the autumn of 1821, in the clear golden light that came through the east wing windows, now that the chimney problem was resolved, and the rooms were warm, and the air moved through them, the way it was meant to. He had Charles's eyes and Rosalind's composure and a quality of attention in his first weeks that she recognized with a feeling too precise and too complete to be called simple happiness. William received his brother with the gravity of an elder child who has considered the situation and found it acceptable. He also, on the first morning, climbed into the chair beside Rosalind's desk and picked up her pen and attempted to make a mark in the ledger, which she allowed on the grounds that it was the date column and she had room in the margin. Charles found them there an hour later. Rosalind at the desk, William on the chair beside her, with the pen and a sheet of practice paper, James asleep in the cradle that had been carried in from the nursery because she had wanted to keep working and had not wanted to be far from him. He stood in the doorway for a long moment without announcing himself. She knew he was there. She always knew when he was there. She kept writing. The ledger was not going to balance itself, and she had 3 outstanding supplier accounts and a letter from the Alnwick sweep regarding the north chimney that required a reply by Thursday. Outside the window, the elms at the edge of the park were turning gold again. She had grown up watching those trees from this room. She was watching them still, and they were the same trees, and she was not the same woman she had been when she was only managing. She was the woman she had always been, now completely visible, in the house where she had always belonged, with the life she had built out of every ledger and every recovery and every decision not to become less than she was. Charles came into the room and sat down across the desk and picked up the letter from the Alnwick sweep and held it out to her without a word. She took it, read it, and wrote her reply, and the morning continued.